In examining those captains of industry or robber barons who earned a tremendous amount of money, the question was raised, how were they able to do this? And while there are many answers, one of the things that we need to examine are the laborers that they employed. Urban labor itself really boomed at the end of the 19th century. In fact, it had increased by 400% by 1890. Whereas before this time period, a lot of Americans were farmers or working in very small or in their own homes producing a product. By 1890, most of them had moved, or the number of people had grown by 400%. Most of the jobs in these urban settings or city settings were unskilled. Unskilled labor means did not require any kind of special education or training. So they could just go find somebody, they could walk through the door, show them how to perform the task a few times, and then they were ready to go. Especially since most of this work was assembly line work, meaning that each person performed a small number of tasks and it was a very repetitive task day in and day out. The working conditions during this time period were terrible. You would describe them as sweatshops, very low wages, a few cents a day, very long hours, 10, 12, 14-hour work days, and they didn't have Saturday and Sunday off. In fact, they often and most of the time worked 6 days a week in very dangerous conditions where many of the workers were injured on a very regular basis. At this point in time, too, there was no such thing as disability insurance or disability benefit. So if a worker was injured on the job, they simply had to come back to work and continue working or depend on their families or those around them to help them. Many of these large companies built what were called company towns. Remember, a company town is a town that is built by a company for its workers. Unfortunately, many of these company towns exploited and took advantage of those workers and treated them very poorly. Child labor was also very common in these factories. Factories employed children because they could pay children less than what they would pay an adult. And oftentimes, and what you will see in other pictures as we continue on in this unit and the next, is that children were very small and could perform tasks that adults couldn't because of their size. In this picture here, these are young children who were called breaker boys who are working in a coal mine. And their job for 10, 12, or 14 hours a day was to sit on those benches that you see here and try to get the large pieces of rock that was attached to the coal as it ran down this chute in between their legs. You see here, this would be their overseer to make sure that they were performing the particular task that they were set out to do. And remember, they didn't get very many breaks, and their well being was certainly not at the top of the list of these managers. Labor unions are eventually going to form in order to try to improve the conditions of their workers. Remember, anytime we discuss a labor union, you're going to have two main goals of a labor union. They are generally looking for better pay for their workers and better working conditions, safer working conditions. They did have various methods that they would try to use to get what they wanted, usually better pay and working conditions. The first is a strike. A strike is simply where they stop working to try to get what they want, and they refuse to go back to work until usually the company owner will negotiate with them or something called collective bargaining. This is where both sides come to the table to discuss what they want. So, collective bargaining is really a fancy word for negotiating. If that failed, arbitration was often in order. Arbitration is where they bring in a third party to negotiate between the sides. Now, the catch with an arbitrator is that both sides have to agree on whatever the arbitrator's arrangement is. But labor unions were able to use these methods in order to get some of what they wanted. But the owners of these big companies did not simply just sit back and let this happen. They blacklisted troublesome employees, meaning that if they heard of a worker who was trying to get other workers to join a union with them, they would fire them and then contact every other company owner in the area to make sure they could not get a job. That's called blacklisting. They also used lockouts. This is where they would basically just lock the doors. If they caught wind of a strike getting ready to happen, they would lock the doors before the workers got there that day and refuse to let them in until they had relented on their demands. If workers did strike, oftentimes they would also bring in what were called scabs. A scab is nothing more than a replacement worker. And often they would use immigrants because immigrants would often work for cheaper than native born workers. So if you were on strike, they would go hire a worker to break the strike and go right into that factory and continue that work. And finally, they often relied on injunctions. They went straight to the government. An injunction is a court order to stop doing something. In this case, they would often get injunctions to require these workers to stop striking and to go back to work. Often they used the term injunction and they would get an injunction with the reasoning that whatever the product was, such as coal, for example, that it was interfering with the running of the government. So, coal production, for example, if they were striking in a coal mine, coal was used to power the railroads were used to deliver the mail. So, that would mean, according to the coal miners or the coal owners, that this was going to prohibit the government from being able to carry out its work. The government did get involved, like the railroad strike of 1877, where this particular strike turned very violent, and eventually they do have to send in federal troops to restore that order. So if it got too out of hand, they would send in the government. Some of the more well-known labor unions, one was the Knights of Labor, led by a man named Terence Powderly. Now, the Knights of Labor accepted any type of labor. Unfortunately, it does eventually fail. One of the reasons is because since there were so many types of labor and unskilled labor, remember, if you're an unskilled laborer, you really don't have any major bargaining chips. There's no reason they can't just go get someone else to perform your job. So that was one weakness, the fact that they did accept unskilled labor as well. But two, the Haymarket Square. When Haymarket Square went south, which we're going to see in just a second, that is going to cause another major problem for them when the labor union was blamed for it, and it's eventually going to lead to the downfall of the Knights of Labor. The Haymarket Square riot was something that occurred in Chicago in 1886. At what started as a peaceful protest, a bomb was thrown. After this bomb was thrown, there were several people killed. While you see in this picture, you see officers and you also see protesters, but in the end, it was the labor union that was blamed for the violence, which is going to lead to the public opinion turning against the labor union movement. The AFL is another very well-known labor union. It stands for the American Federation of Labor, led by Samuel Gompers. This labor union was particularly successful in that it only allowed skilled labor to join, meaning you had a particular skill set that you were trained to do and perform in that company. They were able to make striking a legitimate weapon for the union activity, so they were actually able to get some of what they wanted. Industrial unions are another type of labor union that was used. This is a union combining all workers of a particular industry. So, all railroad workers, all brick masons. This is an example of those industrial unions. Industrial unions were led by Eugene V. Debs. In particular, he led United Railroad Workers. In fact, he was so involved with the industrial unions. So, if you want to, make sure you draw a line from Eugene V. Debs up to industrial unions so you'll remember he was the leader of those. At this Pullman coach strike, the government winds up again intervening. Eugene V. Debs goes to jail over the his charges from this strike when he was arrested. He goes into jail a major labor union advocate. He comes out of jail as a socialist, meaning he starts to believe that the government should have more control over industry to keep these big businessmen from making such extreme profits and to allow workers to make a much better and more fair wage. Women are also going to be very involved in these movements. They were in particular fighting for better conditions for miners. So they would picket, try to bring attention to that. Women and children both were used in the strike process. They realized that this would get them a lot more attention if they put these injured and harmed individuals in the public sight so they could see just exactly what was happening inside these factories. Mary Harris, or nicknamed Mother Jones, was one of the most well known advocates who was against child labor, who was against or who was for better working conditions in all various types of industries. And again, most women were also against child labor. Eventually, the public begins to push for better working conditions and for regulations on these big businesses. However, when you start putting regulations on businesses in regards to how much they pay their workers and safety standards, it leads to higher prices. So while the people do support the workers and can identify with the workers' want of better pay and working conditions, they also like cheap products that are produced under that system. But eventually, even though they're having that trouble, there are things that happen that they can no longer ignore. The Triangle Fire was one such example. A fire broke out on one of the upper floors in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. When this fire breaks out, one of the exits had been blocked. The elevator could only be used for a small amount of time, and the fire blocked another exit. So there were many workers, mostly women, who were trapped inside the building. When the fire trucks arrived, their ladders would only reach to 2 floors below where the fire had broken out. So the women were stranded, many of them jumping from the building rather than burning to death. When this happens, it is going to make the front page of the newspapers. This was such a terrible tragedy that it leads the American people to question the methods that were used by business owners to get these cheap products. And eventually, it does begin the movement to getting government regulations on working conditions as well as protective legislation for both children and women. The Homestead strike is another labor union strike that turns very, very violent. This is one of Andrew Carnegie's factories or plants. This becomes very violent and winds up completely damaging Andrew Carnegie and his entire reputation. So this one has a lasting impact as well, followed by the Ludlow strike that has a very similar result for John D. Rockefeller. So we do see that even though these labor unions continue to work over all this time, that it was really very slow progress to get better working conditions and to get safer working conditions as well as better pay. And it's something that many workers even continue on into today.